Hey everyone, welcome back to Security Unscripted. I'm your host, Vincent Danon, and today I actually don't have any guests with me, so you're stuck with me and me alone. One of the things I wanted to talk to you today was about open source maintainers, and particularly this strange notion that we keep hearing over and over again about open source maintainers being some kind of a security problem, or problem in general. And the reason why I'm so passionate about this is because I am an open source maintainer, and I have been for a very long time. For those of you who don't know me, I've been involved in open source for over 20 years. I started off just as a contributor to Linux Mandrake back at the time. Mandriva was the name, maybe. Well, they're bankrupt now, so I don't know how many people are actually familiar with them. If you're an old time open source enthusiast, you'll be familiar with Mandriva. Anyway, so I was working with them. I was their security team for a number of the 8 years that I was there with them. But even during that time, I was working on open source, both as a packager to Mandriva. I created my own bug tracking system called Anthill. I was actually Mandriva back at the time was using Bugzilla for bugs. Incidentally, I like Bugzilla now. Actually, I really like it. But back then, I was not a Perl guy. I was a PHP guy, and I couldn't stand Bugzilla. And I needed a bug tracking system for myself because I also created an operating system called Nvix, which was a security-oriented Linux distro, kind of modeled after OpenBSD, forked from Mandriva, and radically slimmed down, ripped out X Windows, did all kinds of really cool stuff. Worked on that for 5 years. So I can empathize with a lot of open source maintainers who have challenges in the way that they're having to deal with open source maintenance, and also empathy with them, because having sat in their shoes, I know what it's like to have, can't even call them customers, users demanding things from you and no dollars in sight, right? So one of the things that actually really kind of brought this to mind for me recently was a new article out by the Register called "Open Source Maintainers Are Really Feeling the Squeeze," is what it was called. And they raise a lot of really important things, right? About non-paying users demanding security fixes or security enhancements. I've heard of open source maintainers being asked for security attestations so that a downstream user, not a customer, could attest to their own compliance, regulatory regimes, things like that they have to attest to. And so they're pushing those demands upon upstream open source maintainers who aren't selling a product. They're making their source code available for anybody on the internet to be able to use it because labor of love, passion projects, scratching their own itch, frankly, is why a lot of these open source projects that don't have commercial backing start. Somebody scratching their own itch. In fact, I just did this myself. Just before Christmas, wrote a Vex parsing library in Python, published it. It's on PyPI, made it available for people. I'll talk about it in a future episode because I actually think Vex is really neat. Anyways, I did it to scratch my own itch because I didn't find, there were some good Vex parsing things out there, but nothing that really worked for what I was looking for. So I just created it because there wasn't one. And you can do that with open source, which is pretty awesome. One of the things that actually makes me more concerned about this moving forward, though, is the European Union's Cyber Resilience Act, or the CRA. Not so much today, but we'll say a year ago, maybe more, a lot of concerns because there was some language around the CRA basically stating that anyone who was developing open source software, making it available to European users, could be held liable for any problems arising from the use of that software. So probably a very ridiculously extreme example. Bob, just stereotypical, living at home in his mom's basement in Oregon, right? Writes a piece of open source software, scratches his own itch. It's some Java thing, and some European company is making a smart toaster. And the smart toaster needs that type of software. And they're like, hey, I see this Java thing that Bob wrote, made it available on GitHub. It's available for me to use. I can grab it. right? Open source license says that I can modify, distribute, use it as is with no guarantees or warranties, right? Most of these open source licenses have that. Throw it into my smart toaster. Little old lady, Germany, Netherlands, wherever, using the smart toaster. Smart toaster happens to burn their house down, and somebody has got to be held responsible. Is it the manufacturer of the toaster, or is it Bob in Oregon in his mom's basement who's liable because maybe there was a bug in this Java software that maybe the end user who took that software, put it into this toaster, didn't bother to update? Totally far-fetched example, right? But it illustrates what was getting a lot of open source maintainers really, really concerned about some of the initial language that was in the CRA. And there was even talk back then, I'd heard from a couple open source foundations that were like, hey man, we're just going to have the great firewall of Europe. This isn't the firewall of China. This is the firewall of Europe, basically disallowing European Union member states from downloading open source software from a particular foundation that resided in Europe for fear of this as a way of protecting their developers, right? I don't think that that's actually going to happen, thankfully, because some of that language has changed in the CRA, thankfully. But these are those knee-jerk reactions, right? And these are things that make open source maintainers nervous, fretful, stressed out, frankly, about some of these open source contributions that they make, or even their willingness to create to open source contributions in the future, right? So one of the things I think it's really important to note is that, maintainers value money, and there's a ton of unpaid maintainers. Tidelift has some really good data that we'll get to in a second. So maintainers value money, but they also value time, right? A lot of open source maintainers have jobs. They work on their open source projects, maybe a couple hours a week, if that, depending on where it is in its life cycle. Like even for myself with my Vex library, spent a bunch of time at front. It's exciting. It's fun. I'm making it work. Now it's kind of a little bit in maintenance mode, so I don't spend a ton of time on it. It's not overly complicated software. So I'm doing my job, and maybe on the weekend I'll tinker with it a little bit, refactor some code, whatever. But most of these open source maintainers have full-time jobs, right? So when you're looking at what is the thing that's valuable to them, it's not necessarily money, because already they have a job. Unless you're going to pay them more than they're making at their job, you still have to pay their bills, so they still need their full-time job. So a little bit of extra cash on the side, helpful, but sometimes it depends on how many strings are attached, right? So I think a lot of open source maintainers actually value contribution more, right? They want other people to come in, help with their project, maybe doing some of the stuff that they don't like, documentation, maybe some of the security work, those sorts of things, right? Rather than just money. Last Easter, it was around Easter, the whole XeUtils incident with some malware being introduced upstream, cleverly disguised. I'll call it a great social engineering hack, because it wasn't great, but it was certainly clever and persistent. The attacker was definitely persistent. But after XeUtils, the 2024 Tidelift report indicated that about 2/3 of maintainers are less trusting of contributors. So even if we want to have more people contributing to open source software because of that, a lot of people are more skeptical of those contributions. So kind of what are we looking at there, right? Tidelift also says that about 60% of maintainers are still not paid for their work. That was in the 2024 report. And actually, I looked back at their 2021 report, and the number's higher now, actually. Maybe they had more people that they were surveying. I'm not sure. Well, probably. But back in 2021, that number was 46% of maintainers were not being paid. And as of 2024, 60% not being paid, right? Another thing that's interesting, I love Tidelift, by the way, one of my favorite companies. And the reports are awesome, like definitely worth looking at. Their 2023 report noted that 60% of maintainers either have quit or considered quitting open source altogether. just because of all the stress and expectations that are put on them by end users who will go to them and say like, hey, I'm using your software. I found this bug. I found this security issue, irrespective of how big or small it is, and I'm demanding a fix from you. Or I want to use your software in my product, and I need these attestations from you so that I can do so. Right? I'm not willing to pay any money. I'm not willing to enter into a contract with you, but I need these things from you because I'm using your software, and you're kind of obligated to do that. Which actually made me think, and I went looking as I was thinking about this episode. There's the flip side, right? I think there's actually a healthy balance, right? I do think there is some social responsibility on open source maintainers who are making their software available. Like, yes, there is a license that basically says no guarantees for fitness, use it as is, use it at your own discretion. But at the same time, you're making the software available, and there's a certain amount of pride, maybe social responsibility to say like, hey, you know what, I should actually take care of this thing that I've created and made available to the public. Some people seem to sit there and take the extreme opposite end and be like, you know what, everyone who doesn't enter into a commercial agreement with you for your software, just go tell them to pound sand. Right? You don't owe them anything, which is, I mean, on the surface of it, it's actually fair. But I also don't think it's helpful. Right. And when I look at people like the maintainers for Log4j, for example, Log4Shell for me is a story of unsung heroes and open source maintainers. I mean, these guys had to deal with 3 fixes over the span of a week or two. The first one, like super critical, like 10 out of 10 CVSS, rated critical, like nasty stuff. Right. These guys dropped everything. They weren't making money off of it. It wasn't even for functionality that was there that they particularly enjoyed or even thought was necessary. It was there as a concession to users from the prior version of Log4j who expected and relied upon this functionality. They lost a bunch of time and took a ton of crap from people for these security issues. And they, without asking for a dime, I mean, a thank you and a please might be nice, but without asking for anything, they rolled up their sleeves and they got their noses in the mud and they got to work. Right? They gave up their weekend, gave up their families, gave up their time because it was the right thing to do. It was the right thing to do. You have to, I think, when you have these things, particularly when they're that bad, like there is a social responsibility there, and they lived up to their end of the social contract. Right? Maybe it's time that other people who are on the other end of that social contract start living up to their end as well, right? I think that's through things like sponsoring maintainers. Companies like Tidelift or GitHub or others who are actually funding maintainers as well. I mean, they're probably not going to get rich off of it, but I mean, if you enjoy the software that you're using, I mean, yeah, why not? Pay some money for it, right? When I was working on Anvix, as an example, I was working for 5 years on this. And keep in mind, it wasn't just like a Vex parsing library in Python. This was an entire operating system, right? Soup to nuts. I was the sole maintainer of this operating system, had my own rack full of machines, 3 machines that were building the software, my build environment, doing all the development work. I think I released five GA versions of this thing over the 5 years. Quite a few people were using it. A lot of people expressed admiration for it and enjoyed it. I think I made $500, $500 in 5 years working on it. Right now, for me, I wasn't in it for the money. I mean, I stopped doing it because there was no money in it. But I learned a ton. Like it was instrumental for me, for my career, just for me being able to tinker, and it was a great outlet for that. But it came at a cost, right? My daughter was young at the time. I gave up time with her to tinker on this stuff. It comes with cost, right? And that's what all of these open source maintainers are paying, whether we are aware of it or not. They're paying for it. And in fact, in the case of the XCUtils issue, I mean, that maintainer was able to be social engineered just because of the pressure, because of time, because of mental health, life circumstances, all of these things. Like, these open source maintainers are people, and they need to be treated as such, right? And I think that they should be compensated for their efforts. And I think that people should understand what their role is. You can't make demands on open source free software. I mean, unless you're going through an enterprise vendor, right? Like then at some point, if somebody is curating that open source for you and you're paying them, not the end maintainer, you're paying that company, sure, you can have all the expectations you want in that company because now you're paying for a service. But when you're grabbing it straight from upstream, you're not paying for a service. I could probably keep ranting about this, and I don't want this to turn into a bit of a rant. My point is open source maintainers are heroes. I think open source has changed the world. The world is powered by and running on open source now, whether you like it or not. Open source has won. If we're still thinking about things in terms of winning and losing, open source has won, plain and simple. No one is contesting that. The rules are changing, and we'll get into that in some other future episodes. Talked about this. I was just actually talking about this in last week. You know, there is a difference between open source and proprietary software that is not, on the surface, it should be, it's common sense. It's pretty obvious. But when you stand back and take a look at it, we don't treat them like they're different. And we're not treating open source maintainers the same way. Just because I give you some software for free doesn't mean you get to make all the demands on me. We have to start understanding that. Right? We have to start understanding that. Otherwise, this wonderful thing that we've built and that, frankly, the world relies on is going to disappear from a security perspective or otherwise, right? Open source needs to be, I don't say it needs to be treated with kid gloves, but especially to all the regulators and lawmakers and policymakers and things like that are out there, like you have to keep in mind it's a different animal. You can't treat it the same way as you treat the Fortune 500 companies and whatnot that you're imposing things on. Anyways, if you're interested, I'm going to leave a link to the interview that I did with my good friend Donald Fisher at Tidelift. We talked about this last year at the 2024 Upstream event. We talked about open source and open source contributions and about how we should be taking care of our maintainers because our maintainers take care of us and all of the things that we depend on. So I'm going to leave it there. It ran over a little bit longer than I wanted to, but I'm super passionate about this topic. We'll talk about it more and dig into some things a little bit more detail. But in the meantime, check out that video with Donald and I talking about this stuff last year, and we'll talk to you soon.